Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's the after lunch slot, so people will still be trickling in, but we'll get started because we've lots of really interesting topics to get through. So welcome to this afternoon's session on CORSIA. I'm Anna Hickey, and I'm a partner at Philip Lee, specializing in climate finance. So as most of you will know, CORSIA is the global market-based initiative aimed at reducing aviation emissions. In this session, we'll discuss the actions that governments, the aviation sector, and carbon market stakeholders will need to take to operationalize CORSIA. I've had to practice that word a few times. This includes the needs for units to be ultimately correspondingly adjusted under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of specialists today from ICAO, the aviation sector, the standards, and the private sector. I will introduce them as I go, but up on the board. Great, so just a quick show of hands. Who is familiar with CORSIA and how it works? Pretty much everyone in the whole room. Okay, good. I don't need to go into real basics, but I suppose to set the stage, we're almost now nearly 1 year into the first phase of CORSIA, which runs from 2024 to 26. And this is when the offsetting requirements kick in for airlines that are in scope, although the retirement obligation doesn't kick in until 2028. So I think it's fair to say we're a while away yet from a functional CORSIA. There's only 4.6 million eligible CORSIA units in the world, which are from the ART-TREES program in Guyana. So to kick us off, I'll turn to Benedict. Benedict von Butler is a partner at Evolution Environmental Asset Management here in Berlin. And so Benedict, from the perspective of an investor with your portfolio, there are various projections that there's around 100 to 200 million CORSIA eligible units that will be required for the whole of the first phase. And yet there are only a tiny fraction of that available. Futures pricing remains fairly low at the moment. And why do you think demand for CORSIA eligible units remains so thin at the moment? Or is it more a case that supply is the issue instead? So grateful for your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe as a very quick intro, just so you know, why would I have an opinion on this and why should you listen, is that I think to answer that question is interesting that I was involved in literally the very first deal under the European ETS at the time and have seen this grow for one deal a month to one deal a week to suddenly daily deals, and now we have a real big system. And so operationalizing CORSIA is a similar experience to say, how do you kick something off at all? And in this case, as you said, how do you drive demand? Because given the potential demand side and given that supply prices should be through the roof, so what's going on? And I think it helps to say or to ask yourself the question: what drives demand in the first place? And to put it with one sentence is: you have demand if buying a carbon credit is the better option. The better option compared to what? And so usually any emitter in a scheme has two options, which is to make or to buy. And so as airlines, you don't have so many make positions other than energy efficiency in the aircraft themselves. And you can buy, but you can buy sustainable aviation fuel or you can buy carbon credits. And if you buy carbon credits, you can buy either primary projects or you can go to an exchange. This is basically your field of options. So why is so little happening? And so let's look at the risk side. What is holding back demand at the moment? And I have some very spontaneous notes to this very spontaneous question. And one is liability around the units. To figure out, and you all know about revocation problems. What is it if the reporting happens after you have a letter of approval, but it doesn't get reported, it doesn't get adjusted? And maybe hear more. Is it the standards that have liability? So I think that's something to be sorted out. Then on an implementation point of view for the airlines is: do I buy now? Do I buy monthly? Do I buy end of year? Do I buy maybe at the end of the compliance period? What's my strategy around it? So it has to do with capacity building. That again is a derivative or a function also of the penalties. So far there's hardly any legislations that have publicized on a state level any penalties, and I think that's definitely a stick that would drive demand. I learned in this conference, so there are now a couple of notable developments in Canada and elsewhere where you actually have enforcement, but I think that's definitely a stick that would make airlines look into this a bit further. Volume, you obviously need the systems to track your emissions that you want to hatch or buy for on a more or less regular basis. Do you have the systems? Do you have monthly number, yearly number? When do they come out? How is it reported to the risk manager? And lastly, of course, accounting, which we heard in the prior session. It's not so easy to account for this in the different member states. And so if you're a big corporate and you buy something, you need to have a way to account for it. How do you actually print this? How do you account for it? And lastly, and I think it's more like a soft problem, is that we learned from the early beginnings of the EU ETS is who's actually in charge of managing that risk. And I remember in the EU ETS, we had an ESG guy, because it's environmental, who was in charge of managing and buying compliance units. And he was going at the beginning of the year and say, "Hi, management, I need a budget." And at the end of the year, he wanted to buy carbon credits, or in this case, allowances, and suddenly prices were twice as high. He said, "What the hell?" And the management would say, "What the hell?" And then they figured and said, this is something you have to manage. It's not a procurement where you have a budget. It's actually a market that you need to manage. And then it went to Treasury, and then eventually ended up in a trading desk to manage risk because prices move. And I think that is an evolution we haven't really seen yet, the designated responsible person for that. And then lastly, this has to do with risk taking. So if you are a procurement employee, you don't get rewarded for taking risk. So you try to avoid risk, right? And avoid risk is, oh, I don't know this, he didn't improve this, and so forth. If you're a trader, there's a risk reward. You say, yeah, I take some risk because there's a chance I make a lot of money. And I think that's an important factor in these decision-making and becoming active. And so to wrap up the solution, my view would be to de-risk the upstream in terms of more certainty or insurance products, to almost increase the risk downstream, where you say there's penalties, and in the middle that you have capacity building within the airlines around risk management, and maybe engage some professional risk managers like banks, where you say, can you procure this for me for the next 3 years? This is what I'm willing to pay. And the banks have the risk appetite. That would be my input.
Thanks, Benedict. Some really great ideas there, and I think we'll be touching on some of those questions as well from Wolf in a minute. And then next to Andrew. So Andrew Howard, as many of you may know, is a Senior Director of Climate Policy and Strategy at Verra. And the VCS, which is Verra's standard, one of Verra's standards, is one of the programs that has been conditionally approved to supply eligible units for the first phase, having successfully been approved for the pilot phase. And so, Andrew, you've seen a lot of practicalities from the program and project developer perspective in going through this process with the TAB over the past while. From that and just generally, what do you think is the main challenge from the standards perspective in operationalizing CORSIA?
Yeah, and thanks a lot. And I think we speak here in the context of everybody is waiting to actually have eligibility decisions come through from the ICAO Council for Verra, our VCS program, but of course also for other programs within the voluntary carbon market set of standards. So we're all waiting for that, and the timeline for that, as we understand it, is November this year. The ICAO Council meets across October and November. Juan Carlos will know more about this, but we're also waiting with bated breath for that. In terms of challenges, I think a lot of the challenge that we faced as a program is to be able to work through all of the criteria and make sure that we not only meet the standards which are there in the criteria, but also demonstrate to ICAO that it's there. But I think also at the same time, because this area is very fresh, is very new, we're in an environment where we have Article 6 rules, which everyone is trying to understand. I think the same goes for the CORSIA rules. And I think there is a journey that we've been on, and to a certain extent, I think ICAO has been on that, of trying to define exactly what the requirements should be. And for us, there's been particularly some issues around the way that our systems are set up to ensure that double counting is guarded against. So we from the get-go, we've had our systems of letters of authorization, and that to us is a commitment that the country will actually do its corresponding adjustments. What ICAO has been very cautious about is wanting to make sure that the system is fail-safe, so that if you have a situation where a country actually does not do the corresponding adjustment that it said it would, then the environment needs to not be disadvantaged by that. And hence, what ICAO has been encouraging us to build up is stronger mechanisms for ensuring that there must be compensation in the case of a country not doing its corresponding adjustment. Now, that's not to suggest that it's a strong likelihood that it's going to happen, but the regulatory system needs to make sure that those safeguards are in place. And so what we've built up in Vero, and I think this is mirrored in other programs as well, is that for those wishing to have a CORSIA label on a credit for any mitigation which has occurred after 2020, so that's January 2021 onwards, in order to get a CORSIA label for that, to signal the eligibility, then what we will require is what we're calling an accounting representation. It's an actual commitment from whoever it is that's providing it to us, that they will compensate for any corresponding adjustments which have not been done by a country. And at the same time, we're requiring evidence of insurance which can support the case that whoever is giving that commitment is actually in a position to make that compensation. And compensation essentially means getting some other credits and cancelling them in order to compensate for the fact that the corresponding adjustment has not been done. So that's what we've put into place, and we've been building that up more strongly since we received the last conditions from the ICAO Council. So that's hopefully going to be a sufficiently robust system that will go through the test of the TAB and then the ICAO Council in November.
Great, and I'm sure there will be lots of discussion around that today. And thank you, Andrew. And to Juan Carlos. So Juan Carlos is Arredondo is a senior director at McKinsey, but is joining us in his capacity as a member of the ICAO's TAB. So thank you for joining us, Juan Carlos. We spoke about governments and their role in, I suppose there's a central piece here of Article 6 in that units for CORSIA need, phase 1 and later, need to be correspondingly adjusted, or at least have a pathway to be correspondingly adjusted. And so that is obviously a host country function. Yes. But in general, I think we lose sight that much of CORSIA is driven by governments, being those ICAO member states. And so, Juan Carlos, what do you think governments can do better to operationalize CORSIA at the moment?
Thank you. And maybe I should start by saying, yes, I work at McKinsey right now.
Yes.
But I'm here in a personal capacity as member of the TAB, so nothing to do with anything else. So as member of the TAB, I am one of the 19 people who do the assessment of the applications of any standard or creating program that wants to aspire to be eligible for CORSIA. So that's in that capacity that I am responding today. And I respond as individual, not on behalf of ICAO, the TAB, or anyone else. Going back to the question on why governments and their role in making CORSIA operational, in my view, there are three main things that governments can do. One is internal coordination, because countries who are party to ICAO are usually represented by the civil aviation authorities or agencies or the equivalent. However, anything that has to do with climate policies, letters of authorization, attestation, Article 6, corresponding adjustments, and all of that is usually in the hands of the Ministry of the Environment, Sustainable Development, or the equivalent. And that is often the case that they don't talk to each other so often. Yeah. So sometimes there is a miscommunication in terms of the need for a host country to actually engage in that commitment that it has as country under ICAO to issue a letter of attestation or of authorization in which it commits itself to properly account to the units that are CORSIA eligible. And in that process, to do the corresponding adjustments for the proper international global accounting of the mitigation. Yep. So that miscommunication or that lack of coordination is an important challenge, and sometimes a block in many instances, because those ministries may not know that this is something that they must do, and they think that project developers, owners, investors, or the standards are approaching them with a random request, and it's not the case. So that's the first thing. The second is precisely the accounting of the units in an accurate, transparent manner. And that has to do with acknowledging that they have a commitment to do that type of accounting according to their commitment on their Article 4 of the Paris Agreement and everything that has to do with enhanced transparency as well, in addition to the commitments made under Article 6. And on the side of CORSIA, what they have to do is to issue the letters of attestation in which they commit to do the adjustments. They have to report those adjustments to ICAO on a regular basis. And the guidance that they have now for doing the adjustments are coming from Article 6. So all of those bits and pieces that are somehow split in different places is something that governments need to know for the person or the agency or the ministry in charge of the accounting to do the right thing, not to do it in the right way. And the third point that I think is relevant for the full operationalization, no, with the support of the governments, is something that Benedict was touching on, the part of risk reduction. How can governments help those projects that become the source of CORSIA-eligible units to actually be successful, for the standards to reduce the risk as much as possible, and for the airlines who are the ones buying and canceling the units for compliance for CORSIA to not be exposed unduly to some government decisions related to a revocation of a letter, the lack of reporting, no, the lack of a proper adjustment to the units, and the governments, it's their responsibility to some extent to participate in that process. What type of instruments or government-backed solutions can they have to reduce the risk of lack of corresponding adjustments, lack of issuance of a letter that they have to issue, or the revocation of such? And also, if it's not what they do, how can they work with the market, no, with some type of guidance or regulation for the market to create these type of instruments that facilitate the operationalization?
Thanks, Juan Carlos. I think that's a really interesting point about government-based solutions. I think we've been hearing a lot about insurance stepping in to help bridge this gap for the double claiming issue, and most of that seems to be around private sector or indeed MEGA. And then also the point you made around reporting and capacity building, I think that's been a bit of a theme over the 3 days that we've been hearing. So turning to you, Wolf. So Wolf Dietrich Kind joins us today from the German Aviation Association, and perhaps you might tell us a little bit about your role there. He's Director of Climate and Environmental Protection. But Wolf, for the aviation sector perspective, as it is ultimately airlines that have the burden of compliance with CORSIA, I mean, we're hearing generally from the market that there isn't that much engagement yet from airlines in CORSIA. What is the reason for that, and are we doing enough as a market to bring airlines along the journey? And is it overly complex, or what are the issues from your view?
Well, in my view, airlines are ready to participate in CORSIA and to comply with CORSIA. They have all the processes at hand. They have employed the staff. They have built up the knowledge. The only thing is that there is no market at the moment. And the question is, why is there no market? And that's maybe the second question. The first question is that how can we deal with that? Because it's a very inconvenient situation, or very unpleasant, when you are an obligated party, but you have no options to comply. Because at the moment, you cannot buy any units, which you need to cancel in 2028, which is not too far away. And at the moment, you have literally nothing, to be honest. You have those 4.6 million you mentioned, but at the moment, you say airlines are not engaged enough. That's because there's no market. You don't start buying from a market which isn't a market. If you have only one supplier, that's not good for pricing. And anyway, you know, nobody can comply with only 4 million certificates. You need about 160 million. So there's no point in buying at the moment. And at the moment, I want to give the, I don't want to say scapegoating, but at the moment we are waiting for the regulators to do their homework, actually, because CORSIA is a project not of the airlines, but of the ICAO member states. And airlines are only obligated parties, and obligated party means eventually you just buy EEUs. That's your role. You buy EEUs. So it's a very convenient situation. Go on the market and buy EEUs, but there aren't. Of course, you could argue, well, why don't you create your own units? I think that's not something an airline can do. That's out of their business. They can buy units. They are experienced in buying credits from different schemes, be it ETS, be it voluntary market credits, and so on. So that's what airlines can do. What airlines cannot do is they cannot sign the LOAs. The member states have to do that. They cannot implement any projects. Project developers have to do that. All they can do is offer their willingness to buy. And in fact, to mitigate the risk, you both mentioned that correctly. And a risk reduction is partly is a function that banks need to offer. That's what banks are for. It's a very natural position in the economy that banks transform risks. On the other hand, there are some risks that banks cannot transform because it's not in their hand, and that's regulatory risks. And Juan Carlos just spoke about the host countries. I don't elaborate on that because I would repeat that. But there's the other side of the countries that buy the airlines, let's say in Europe, which buy the EUs from the host countries, and we don't have regulatory clarity here. Even though we are developed countries, and we must be faster than we are at the moment. At the moment, there's as an airline, you can see your bank and say, I want to buy EEUs, and they say, tell me what you want. And the airline says, I'm not sure what I want because I don't have the clarity. Because in the ETS we have an Article 11A, we have deviating requirements from the CORSIA requirements, and we're waiting for delegated acts from the European Commission to actually tell us what that means. Because you can have your own fantasy what it means, but in the end, if you buy something, you want to be sure. And so we have those two sides. On the supply side, regulators have to do their job, or countries have to do their job on the demand side as well. And the airlines, they are not so much in the driving seat at the moment because they are actually suffering from this situation, as they are at the moment don't know how to comply in only 4 years.
Yeah. Well, that's I think that's a really interesting perspective, because I think there's perhaps a feeling in the market of, the airlines are just waiting till the last minute perhaps, or why have we not heard about them maybe engaging in the futures contracts or otherwise. But I think you've highlighted a lot of the challenges that airlines face, and I think that's really, really valuable. I think you've probably answered much of my next question, but I think I'll just set the stage, and maybe Benedict could, I'll pass it to Benedict. But in 2026, as many of you will know, the EU Commission is going to assess whether CORSIA is delivering against the Paris Agreement goals. And if not, certain flights that are currently out of scope for CORSIA will become in scope. And those are flights that are departing the EEA. And I think, Wolf, one of the questions I had was whether CORSIA is effective enough at the moment to keep those extra EU flights outside of the EU ETS. And I was going to ask you, from what you're seeing in Germany and from your aviation, I suppose, members, is the national implementation happening? And from what I'm hearing, it's probably not sufficiently. So grateful for your thoughts on that. And then also, Benedict, because you've worked for many years with the EU ETS, and just your views as well on the implications if the EU unstops the clock next year. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts or on that particular topic.
Well, it's a very good question, and I wish I had an answer, because there's so many uncertainties in that question. The EU says we drag the CORSIA flights into the ETS, and we are examining, we are reviewing that, and we do it we're having a report in 26. 2026. But this deadline doesn't really fit to the CORSIA timeline. So in 2026, you cannot, by any means, you cannot present a report that is meaningful in any way to give you an answer on the question. It has two criteria, and both are kind of vague. Number one is if 70% of global aviation emissions are covered under CORSIA, that would be good to go. That's, you might say, okay, 70%, it's a hard number and it's easy to check yes or no, but it's not, because they say, is it legally under the CORSIA, or is it complied under CORSIA? Yeah? Because if in I don't know, a given country, airlines say, the penalty is much cheaper than the EEUs, so I pay the penalties, don't buy EEUs. Is it then under CORSIA, or is it not under CORSIA? So from being a very precise number to it's a very vague number, because you don't say what is included and what is not included. And even more difficult is the second criteria, which is CORSIA needs to contribute to the long-term goal of Paris. Yeah, I mean, in 26, it's impossible to say, because the cancellation period is in 28. So we don't know what it's going to be, how many EUs will be cancelled in 28. It's impossible to say. And then CORSIA, by its very nature, is a scheme that ends in 2035. It needs to be expanded. So in order to contribute to a long-term goal, it needs to be expanded. I don't know, will it be expanded or not? Nobody knows that in 2026. So it's a lot of fantasy and a lot of guessing. And that's what I say. What I said before, we need more clarity in order to engage in CORSIA, and the many question marks that we already have and that are added on those questions mark on top, because we don't know how the European Commission will assess CORSIA, and then might or might not drag all those flights into the ETS. Doesn't help the situation.
Yeah, it does seem that the timing does seem a bit out of kilter. I will agree with that. And we don't have anyone from the EU Commission here on the panel, unfortunately. We could ask them that. But Benedict, do you have any other thoughts on that topic?
I do, funnily. And I think, structurally it's a super interesting proposition, because it means to take something out of a baseline and credit project-based market into a cap and trade market, which are two fundamentally different schemes with benefits and disadvantages on both sides. And so the benefit is that you would overnight enter a highly developed market, clear rules, clear demand and supply. You can have fantastic risk assessments because it's a determined number of it's a cap, and depending on underlying developments and demand, you can kind of assess the prices, and you have a huge infrastructure of intermediaries, risk management. You could hedge without problems with options if you want 5 years out. So you literally enter a very mature, probably the most mature and advanced market in the world from a risk management perspective. Would make things a lot easier, but at a cost. And cost, I don't only mean monetary costs. It would probably be multiple times more expensive than relying on projects for the same kind of ton of reduction. So the question is that, good use of funds for society to pay potentially 100 euros or more for a ton of reduction when you could achieve 5 times that elsewhere. But the cost is also that you would completely stop the flow into projects, right? And so you would go from multiple SDGs around these projects to 0 SDGs, pretty much. Is that something that you want? And I think ultimately what you really want from a high level is that CORSIA develops into a mature market like the EU ETS. But I think bringing EU ETS in is also, in a way, if you assume, and you would know more about the projections, but if you assume that the airline sector is a growing sector, they would compete for a constant scarcity of EUAs, and that would really increase prices a lot more, not only for the airlines, but for the whole European industry. Is that tenable and desirable? And so I think it's probably worth to make the effort to mold CORSIA into something mature by de-risking the upstream and having some enforcement, and have flows into projects with a lot lower cost per ton and a lot higher amount of SDGs. That's my view.
Thank you, Benedict. That's a really interesting point about the reducing allowances, because you almost come back around to the point then of, will the EU allow project-based carbon into the EU?
Exactly,
ETS?
it opens a whole other kind of world.
And I suppose moving on to Article 6, which is a very relevant component of CORSIA, I think a lot of people are interested in. A question to Juan Carlos is, there is some confusion around the relationship between Article 6 units and what's eligible for CORSIA. I suppose there was an announcement recently around Suriname jurisdictional red. For example, will that be eligible for CORSIA even if it receives an LOA? And then what about units that will be issued once the 6.4 mechanism is up and running? So yeah, grateful for your thoughts on that.
As simple as that. A simple question.
Two parts.
Yes, I mean, for sure there are plenty of interactions in between Article 6 and CORSIA. And the main point is because any mitigation activity that happens in any country, in principle, could potentially generate carbon credits, no? Almost by definition. If someone certifies the results, you could have a carbon credit that is valid or useful somewhere. The thing is not that straightforward, because that mitigation activity, whoever is the developer for that or the investor, would have to choose if they conduct their activity according to a national standard, no? According to an international independent standard, if they decide to join the ranks of the new Paris Agreement Sustainable Development Mechanism, Article 6.4, for instance, or if that activity is chosen as part of the bilateral cooperation under Article 6.2. And depending on those different paths, you may have different requirements. However, in all of them, you would need to take into consideration the need for corresponding adjustments. No? And the guidance for corresponding adjustments is coming from Article 6. There is no other place in the world in which countries are negotiating and discussing how to do the math of that, other than the discussions on Article 6. CORSIA and ICAO, it doesn't have any guidance on that. It has a requirement that we must avoid the double counting of the mitigation of any CORSIA eligible result unit, that it goes to the international airspace and doesn't go to anything else. No, that is not double counted. So the interaction is precisely in that point of projects choosing whether or not to go for one use or another in terms of the standard, governments doing their bit in terms of doing the math for the corresponding adjustment of the unit, airlines becoming the buyers, of course, and governments as member of the UNFCCC and as members or parties to ICAO having to make a decision on what goes to what use. No? Because at the end of the day, it's I would say, in the national interest to keep within the country as much mitigation as possible. No? It's in your best interest to achieve your NDC or to aspire to a peak in emissions and reach net zero as country. But at the same time, you know that some other countries may want to have that for themselves as well. And in addition to that, you know that international airspace has to be compensated somehow, which is a CORSIA mechanism. So, long story short, I think the most important component of that interaction is the need for the authorization of the activities for the different uses and the proper accounting of the results for those different uses and claims. I hope that clarifies a little bit to people in the audience. If not, happy to.
I suppose that's really, really helpful. A sort of slight follow-on question is, will TAB need to approve Article 6.4 as a separate
thing?
Program?
Okay,
and similar with
CDM.
A country that is, yes, and indeed a country that issues its own units without them being under VCS or another standard.
So the mandate on their CORSIA, no, on the side of ICAO, is that the TAB must consider the UNFCCC market mechanisms as a possibility of supply for CORSIA eligible units. So that's why at some point the TAB assess CDM, and based on the analysis at that point and the recommendations provided that the Council decided to approve CDM as a source of eligible units for the pilot phase, with some restrictions. For the first phase and the second phase of CORSIA, that mandate of having to assess market mechanisms under the UN implies for us that we have to look into Article 6, in particular Article 6.4 mechanism. The mechanism in itself doesn't exist yet. Plenty of discussions, plenty of documentation, plenty of decisions with the elements of, but it's not a market yet. There is no a single registry, there are not approved methodologies, there is no, in paper, yes, there is an authority that will be issuing the units, but it's not operational yet. It has been in operation, it hasn't been in operation for 2 years, as has been the case for everyone who is eligible, for instance, as part of the requirements. So at some point, we will be facing the assessment of this new mechanism whenever that exists, and making a recommendation to the Council on whether or not these units are also eligible for CORSIA, which means 6.4 units will have NDC uses, other international mitigation uses, including CORSIA, knowing that may be CORSIA eligible, if that's the case, at that point.
Perfect, thank you. That's really, really helpful clarification.
Can I just add something since we added?
Sure.
I think this is a very, very important decision to do, because there is a big, like north of 500 million pipeline of potential eligible CERs between 2021-25 that applied for transition to 6.4.
Yes.
How many of those will be approved by the supervisory body, and how many then would achieve a CA is a very, very different question. But from a commercial perspective, and we're talking about banks, right? So if you ask a bank, take some commercial risk in giving me a forward contract for eligible CORSIA credits, a bank will have an analyst and saying, okay, look at the supply-demand picture. There's enough uncertainty about project performance, operations, and so forth, but this is a volume that's
relevant,
that's very significant. And so any decision that's still pending from TAB, whether or not this is eligible, is a huge question mark. So the sooner you can resolve that, the more seriously can banks and other people provide risk guarantees. But that is a big elephant in the room.
Yes, I think, yes, in the terms of the TAB having to assess that whenever that exists. But I think the key responsibility right now is on countries actually finalizing their conversations, their decisions, for the mechanism to exist and start to operate. Because yes, there are discussions on how to assess the methodologies that will migrate for CDM to 6.4, what happens to the units, the projects, all of that. But on the side of the TAB, what we assess and what we recommend to the Council for CORSIA eligibility is whether the standard or crediting program satisfies certain requirements according to the emissions unit criteria, and if the units issued by that program or standard satisfy certain requirements in relation to what they are, how they are accounted, how they are registered, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we look at the origin, not the projects, not the methodologies, but the standards themselves. In this case, will be the mechanism operating, or CDM at this moment, but 6.4 whenever
approved
it exists,
CDM,
once it exists, and the units. So it's not we just look at CERs independently and approve just the units by themselves. Is the whole package, no? The origin and the result of that.
Thanks, Juan Carlos and Bendix, for very anything we can do to increase supply, I think, is really interesting. And just continuing on the theme of Article 6, we've spoken about letters of authorization being a key plank of CORSIA, and some of the matters relating to the Article 6 rulebook are, of course, still outstanding. I was going to ask Andrew, what are your thoughts in relation to this, and what would you like to see to be agreed in Baku in relation to Article 6? And do you think that's holding back the operationalization of CORSIA at all?
Thanks. I mean, maybe just to touch on what Juan Carlos and Benedict just
absolutely, yeah.
I just want to really emphasize the importance of these compliance regimes looking at the specific programs and not just looking at credits themselves, because that is, it's when you look at the programs and you see the entirety of the package around all of the programmatic rules, and as well as then, in some cases at least, getting down to the methodologies. So I think that's really key, and I'm glad that it's going in that direction. In terms of Article 6 in Baku, I think, in my general sense, and this is not actually a new sense. My sense is there has been sufficient already from Glasgow several years ago to operationalize Article 6, and we're not in need of waiting for further rules in order to be able to operationalize. So the Article 6 part of the equation is, I think, not an issue in terms of unleashing that supply, which can then come into CORSIA. There are a few things which are still subject to decision-making, and they tend to relate to some of the infrastructure issues and some of the accounting issues. Certainly in Baku, there's going to be some decisions to be taken around guidance on how exactly the corresponding adjustments need to be accounted over a full NDC period. So there are some definite things which need to be worked out in Baku. There's some other decisions which need to be taken around the kinds of reporting that governments need to do into the UNFCCC. I would really stress this is not holding back Article 6 implementation. However, I think one aspect of that is that host countries in particular, do need to see the full package of the implications of what they're doing. So they do face a very challenging decision as to what mitigation they can be prepared to allow to go off to another country or to go to an airline under CORSIA, and therefore not to be used, because of double counting rules, not to be used towards its own NDC. And that is a very difficult, and it's also a very strategic decision that the government needs to take. And I do think that some of the success in Baku around Article 6 can contribute to filling in some more of the puzzle that host countries face in order to feel more comfortable in being able to make that decision. And that decision will then lead to more authorizations, because I think it's, assuming that more programs become eligible under CORSIA this year, those programs have got in place all of the what's needed for Article 6 and all the labeling processes, and we're supporting countries as well on their reporting. What we really need to see is more authorizations coming forward from countries. And that, I think, is, once we've got all these other things sorted out, that issue of how many authorizations are going to come forward from host countries is going to be the remaining hindrance to the supply in the CORSIA market. So the more Baku can do in order to allay countries' concerns and allow them to take those decisions to make the authorizations, I think the better off we are.
Thanks, Andrew. I'd agree with that. I think there's a perception that once the conditionally approved programs are approved, that supply will happen overnight, and I think that's not necessarily the case. And on that note, Juan Carlos, in terms of increasing the supply of CORSIA eligible units, a lot of eyes are on the tab, and several standards remain conditionally approved, including the VCS.
Yes.
So what is the expectation, if you can say, for the next ICAO Council meeting in November in relation to the approval of conditionally approved standards, or programs rather, and have those programs provided all the information that's needed now to undergo that assessment?
I think you all understand that I cannot give you the
Yes.
results of that
Of course,
assessment.
yes.
No?
That's why I said if you could say.
So I cannot say anything about Vera, Euro Earth, or any of the ones who have applied to this process. But I think it's very important to highlight the amount of work that all of these programs and everyone who applies undertakes for CORSIA eligibility, for this assessment. They fill down a long application that covers plenty of aspects of who they are, what they do, how they operate. They provide supporting documentation. They engage with us in some conversations. We prepare for them some clarification questions. So there is a lot of interaction and exchange of information. So literally thousands of pages, electronically or physically, but thousands of pages being read and reviewed in this process. And what we are always looking at is if, as part of those conditions that were put to some programs, or whoever is the new applicant, if they can show, they can provide evidence that what they do can be understood as a way to really satisfy the requirement or the criteria for CORSIA. And maybe just a simple example. So for instance, permanence is always a topic, no, in carbon markets in general. And for the assessment, including those who are conditionally eligible, each one of them have a different approach to permanence. Not in principle, not in the principle, but in the metric, or in the way it considers. No? For instance, the 30, 40, 50, 100 years, depending on the activity, the sector, everything. But not just that, but what they do or how they act in the case of a reversal. Mm-hmm. What happens if something happens to the emission reduction, or the project, the activity. And there is no unique way to do that. And you have programs who operate globally. You have standards who operate, for instance, within China only, or Thailand, and any combination in between. So part of what we assess and what we look at, for instance, in some cases, conditional eligibility came from, show us that you have a strong, robust procedures to properly avoid the double issuance, counting, selling, and all of that, no? And knowing that they may have different ways of preparing this, of implementing this. And there is no one-size-fits-all, but we have to look at the individual way by which each of them does this. So long story short, without telling you the results, I think it's commendable the amount of work and the amount of effort that the programs have put for this. And stay tuned for the council decision in November.
I have to ask.
No, that's fine, that's fine.
I'm very conscious of time. We are running fairly short. We will take a few questions from the floor. I would like to remind you that in 5 or 10 minutes there's a plenary closing session commencing over in the big room. Actually, probably in about 5 minutes. So look, we'll take a couple of questions from the floor. If I could take maybe 2 or 3 at once, that'll allow us to get through them a bit quicker. So I'm afraid I can't ask any more questions at this point.
Okay.
Is there
important to ask.
Okay, I have one there. Anyone else? Hey, would you like to?
Just at the front.
Thank you very much for such an interesting and very informative sessions. I'm very excited and interested in CORSIA-related topics. And I have a question here related to the effectiveness of CORSIA. We know that starting from the second phase, starting from 2027, the implementation of CORSIA would be rather mandatory. So, however, there exists a lack of clarity on how CORSIA penalty system gonna work, right? Because I see that so far only a handful of countries just started to transpose aviation's emission offsetting rules into their national rules. So at that time, what if big countries, for example, China, the world's largest emitter, still refuse to join CORSIA? Is there any enforcement measure for that? Yes. And maybe also another question that Anna already probably covered. Let's say if in November, during the next session of TAP, when TAP again assess application of CORSIA eligibility unit, then still no further carbon standard will be accepted. Will be there any compromise to lower requirements, so to increase the supply of CORSIA? Because I see that the lack of liquidity in the market is definitely not so conducive to the effectiveness of the system as a whole. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Who'd like to take that one?
You can
Bendik,
start,
do you
and
want
I
to
can
start, and then maybe Juan
you-
Carlos? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify one thing, is liquidity is not supply. Yeah, so just to be clear, so that's something confusing. Even if you have a lot of supply, doesn't mean you have liquidity. Liquidity you have if people actually trade, and normally they trade because they want to manage risk, and people have different views on what's happening in the future. If you only have bilateral transactions, you can have a lot of volume, but you don't have transparency into price. So I think the market needs liquidity, which is related to supply, but not only. And secondly, also from a market perspective, it's not about what is happening right now in terms of penalties that are visible, and that was also my point, but the market reacts to the perception of what is going to happen in the future, right? That is really the risk. And I think if airlines would want to manage risk, they have to assume that the risk of there being a penalty is bigger than zero, and there should be some management of that risk, right? If you wait until it happens, then you wait for the risk to crystallize, but you're not managing it.
And maybe talking about both topics, the effectiveness of the system and the penalties to ensure or to enforce compliance to some extent, and the limited supply. Bear in mind that CORSIA is a government-led mechanism in the context of the United Nations. So the countries participating in ICAO, as countries, they make decisions on how to do this. What needs to happen after that is, of course, how do you incorporate the global decisions adopted by everyone in the context of the United Nations into your national regulations? So the penalties that can apply, for instance, to airlines for not estimating and reporting or verifying their emissions, something that they have to do on an annual basis, or for not complying with the volumes that at some point may be requested to buy and retire, those go back to the national regulations. So if you look at all of the documentation of CORSIA, you will not find anything that says fees, go to the jail or nothing like that. There is no compliance or enforcement mechanism as such at the global level, which is something similar to what happens under the Paris Agreement. It's up to the countries to do what they have to do, to commit themselves, and then appropriate that and incorporate that into their national regulation to facilitate the enforcement of this. That's the first point. And the second, about the limited supply. Well, yes, right now, as of today, we only have limited supply. However, as you highlighted at the beginning, there is a full cycle in the first phase under which, one, the airlines have to look for eligible units and make whatever commercial decision until they get what they need when they are informed about that, and cancel those whenever that's the time. They have a few years to do that. Similarly, there are a few years for more assessment cycles of the TAP and for more standards and programs to apply to become eligible. Those who are conditionally eligible continue working to achieve full eligibility. So yes, today we have limited supply, but at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, the expectation, if everything goes well, is that more supply will come into the market. Just as a reference, so far we have assessed close to 50 different applicants. 50. So it's not I know that many people mention VERA or gold standard, but there are plenty of other standards in the world working on this. Some in a specific space, Pure Earth, for instance. Some at the regional scale, CAR, ACR, or Global Carbon Council, for instance. Some in a jurisdiction, Thailand, TBER, Premium Bear, CCER in China. All of them can potentially become a source of supply at some point. So please don't get stuck just with, we only have 4.6 from the existing eligible program. There may be more to come. Hope that answers the question.
Andrew, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on the point about potentially compromising requirements. So speaking as one of the standards in the field, that's not what we're looking for. I think what we need to have is compliance regimes which are very clear, in fact, about what the requirements are, and then that is the benchmark that we can all work to. So I think we're not looking for any compromise in the requirements. I think, however, I alluded earlier on to the fact that this seems to be a journey that we're on, and together with the council as well. That sometimes we do have the sense that we're delving more and more into details, and there's further interpretations which then need to be complied with. So I think at some point we need to, if we go through November and we still don't have eligibility, then I think the valid question will be, okay, is it time to stop trying to be so detailed, and perhaps see the bigger picture within the requirements, and focus on having a set of requirements which is stable and maintained and is not further elaborated all the time.
Thank you. I'm afraid I'm only going to be able to take one more question or maybe, okay, two if we can keep them really quick, because I'm conscious that there's the plenary in a couple of minutes. So, gentleman in the front and lady at the back, if you'd like to give me your questions, and then we'll take them. And I'm going to have to just limit the answers to literally like one person, 1 minute each.
Yeah, just very quick, coming from the supply side, talking about corresponding adjustment. The issue is about no double counting, but I think putting the onus on the supply side is both unfair and not very practicable, because double counting, a project developer can check that they don't report the same unit to different standards. The standard body can check that they have the LOA, but the rest is an accounting issue. The emission reduction is delivered, and that part has been provided, but the corresponding adjustment is at government level, at UN level, that needs to be solved. And right now the rules from CORSIA are putting the onus and forcing the standards to passing on the responsibility to project developers. And in my view and many peers' view, that just doesn't make sense.
But yes and no on that very quickly.
Yeah.
Corresponding adjustment is definitely the responsibility of the governments. That's the accounting at the global level is on their hands. The way by which a standard or accrediting program decides to run the burdens of double counting within the requirements is up to the standard. So CORSIA doesn't tell you how. CORSIA tells you you must have procedures to do that. Tell us what are those procedures. And there are different ways by which the different standards have chosen to do that. Why that's the case? Because the compliance on the side of airlines relies on a market-based approach, which is units being sourced from certain standards that are comply with these requirements. And the standards can be, as I said, national standards, or global standards, or regional standards. So, of course, someone who develops projects or investor have to choose where to put the eggs in the different baskets. Yeah. But it's not CORSIA who tells you that this is the way that you have to do that. Not be responsible or be responsible? The countries are the ones who do the corresponding adjustment. What CORSIA requires from the eligible programs is to check that happens and to have mechanisms to respond if something happens to the units that they issued. It's part of the risk that they assume when they decide to be eligible for CORSIA. Sorry, because I know that we're already in plenary time. But just not to elaborate more, no one is obliged to apply for CORSIA eligibility. Those who have applied is because they want to. And in the process of they want to, then this is the filtering thing. No? This is what is assessed. And this is the criteria.
I think Andrew wanted to jump in quickly on that,
yeah.
and then I will take a last question from there.
Don't want
Thank
to
you, Andrew.
monopolize.
Yeah, I'll try to be super quick. So I agree. If a country doesn't do its corresponding adjustment, it should be accountable under the UNFCCC, ideally, right? And that was the case under Kyoto, and it's not the case under Paris. So I can understand that the Council wants someone to be responsible, and it's not able to rely on the UNFCCC because it hasn't taken that decision. The positive thing I would throw into it is with the arrival of new insurance products into the field, we do have mechanisms for being able to solve this. And this is certainly what we've tried to work with. And I hope that that's also acceptable to the Council.
Thank you.
Hi there. So I work for Carbon Pool. We're a carbon insurance company, actually, so your comment was very relevant. We pay out our claims actually in kind, in carbon credits, and I have a question around that. So we're currently developing a CORSIA product, And one of the main things that has been kind of a cause of confusion is that much of the guidance around how to structure our insurance product has been pushed down to the registries, which has already been leading to fragmentation on what exactly an LOA revocation insurance product should look like, especially around compensation. So should our payout, should the compensation that is given be in kind, like what we provide, should it be in cash? So I'm just curious to hear from Tab in particular, should we be expecting any guidance on what an insurance product around LOA revocation should look like? And in particular on the question of compensation in kind versus in cash?
Yes, the tab doesn't produce any guidance on anything. The tab assesses the applications for CORSIA eligibility. Having said that, the key thing that we look at how a program responds to all of these possibilities, no, or all of these risks is if there is a way to ensure that one ton that was avoided or removed or reduced from the atmosphere, no, whatever happens at the atmospheric level, is still maintained after some reversal situation. It has to do with the tons of CO2. Because it's not our role in terms of looking at the integrity to see who receives cash in that commercial transactions. It's for us to ensure that if a unit is supposed to represent the avoidance or the removal of something from the atmosphere, that's preserved. That's the key criteria. So that's my short answer for you to think about how to design the product. And also, I guess, for the standards to decide if they should just work independently with you or come together with same terms for something that applies to everyone. No, that's part of the market.
Did you have one last remark, Benedict?
Yeah,
and then I think we're going to have to
as a buyer or
close.
trader, if I don't get what I'm promised to get, you give me cash, I still have a remaining risk that I have to buy replacement ton at a higher cost. So I'm always happier if you give me another ton. Otherwise, it's mitigating part of my risk, but it's not really mitigating risk.
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry for running over. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think that was a really interesting discussion.